What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Strong.Sistas YouTube channel. In today's video, I'm chatting with a nutritionist about her concerns of plant-based meats, plant-based alternatives, these new plant-based burgers. So in today's chat, I'm very fortunate to chat with Sara Keough, who is a nutritionist for Understanding Ag. So Understanding Ag is a company that's dedicated to spreading the word about regenerative agriculture and helping farmers transition to regenerative practices on their farm. It's founded by some of the big names in regenerative agriculture, such as Gabe Brown, Ray Archuleta, Alan Williams, etc. And Sara Keough has now joined the team as Understanding Ag's nutritionist, which I think is awesome, adding a female touch to the team and also really incorporating the human health aspect, because ultimately human health and soil health are connected. So I also include additional resources in the description below from Sara herself. She wrote some blog posts and has a webinar for Understanding Ag, so definitely check those out after listening to this discussion. For additional resources outside of today's discussion, I would definitely recommend checking out Dr. Van Vliet's paper here, which really discusses how trying to combine these isolated nutrients and protein sources from these various plant compounds into a meat alternative really underestimates the power of whole foods, the synergistic abilities of these nutrients to really come together and do magic inside of our body as real whole food instead of these processed alternatives. So hope you guys enjoy. All right. Hi, Sara. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion about plant-based meats and some concerns from a nutritionist's point of view, specifically an eco-nutritionist, as you, I think, have defined yourself. So if you could give my audience a little background, so how you got into the nutrition space and how you care so much about soil health and human health.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, well, thank you for having me. I mean, I've been watching some of your videos and I love what you're doing with getting your ranch started, as we discussed. But yeah, so my, kind of goes back to Colorado, where I'm originally from. I'm in Maryland now and I have a private practice here. And back in Colorado, my home state, I was working on my biology degree. And I was going, down the path of conservation work. So I wanted to be a conservation biologist. So of course that involved a lot of coursework in ecological studies, environmental studies, GIS, geographical information systems, which I love and miss. But anyway, I was, working outdoors all the time, just with nature constantly up in the Rocky Mountains. And we were just studying a lot of wildlife populations, working on actually saving some of these endangered, really biodiverse areas in the Rockies from, ski resorts that really threaten a lot of the wildlife populations. But anyway, that was sort of the undergrad coursework I was doing at that time. And I always had a passion for health and nutrition. Since a young age, I used to pick up my mom's book of like doctor's home remedies and, herbal books and just read them all the time. So towards the end of my biology degree, as I was finishing up, I just felt like I had a different calling. And I started to go into the healthcare field. And I wanted to do research originally. I wanted to do nutrition research. But I kind of was thinking about clinical work as well. So I looked at grad schools all over the country. I fell in love with a particular school out here in Maryland. I moved, back in 2012, so almost 10 years ago, and got my degree, my master's degree in nutrition and integrative health. And I did an internship while in grad school for the natural care clinic that they had there, working as a clinician one-on-one with people. And I loved it and decided I think I'm actually going to work with people instead of going into research. And kind of just fast forward a little bit, I was actually, I should back up a little bit. When I was in grad school, I was living with my dear friend Virginia Richter, and she was a retired neurologist, and she, just always had this amazing, beautiful regenerative garden. And she lived in France for 6 years at one point in her life, really lived off the land, knew a lot about good food and how to just really grow good food. And she was always talking about soil, always. And at the time I was in grad school, I was working full time. And she was always just geeking out on soil and like, oh my God, the humus and the fungi and the blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, okay, Jenny,
I understand her. I feel her. I get it.
now I do, right? Now we geek out together. But at the time I was just like, I'm just trying to get through grad school and I'm so stressed out. I don't care about soil. And so I had this, this is a little story I always like to tell, because this was sort of a big moment of realization for me, right? On how important soil was to health. I came home one day with some groceries or whatever from like Whole Foods or wherever, and I had some organic vegetables. And I remember getting the celery out, and she goes, I don't know how you can eat this stuff. It doesn't have any flavor. And I said, I just thought she was being a food snob, and I always teased her. And I said, whatever, it's just celery. What the heck celery even supposed to really taste like? Celery. And she would, wait till you try some of the food that grows from my garden. And I said, okay. So, spring, summer came around, and the first time I tried her celery, it was like I was just tasting celery for the first time in my life. Like, oh my God, this is what it's supposed to taste like. Like, holy cow. And that's how I really got into it, because that light bulb went off, and I was like, when you taste like nutrient dense food, it just lights up your palate and your brain in like a whole different way. And it's just, it activates something, right? So I from there I started like just getting into all the regen ag stuff. So I was probably like maybe 6-7 years ago now. And learning from Gabe and Alan and Ray, all these guys that that just really were influential in my career. And then I saw a talk one day with Fred, and with Fred Provenza, and he said the doctors of the future will be ecological doctors, right? And at the time he was kind of talking about farmers being healers of the land and ecological doctors. But I said, what, I think I'm an eco-nutritionist, given my background and how it's kind of all coming full circle with what I want to do now as a nutritionist and helping people. So kind of my little story.
Amazing. I completely understand the finding a different passion or a different calling. And so you kind of going into the nutrition space, but I think that your biology degree and like your working, like your experience there was kind of foundational for you making that connection with the soil and human health later down in your life. And so it just seems like everything's kind of coming together. So really cool. I really appreciate the work that you're doing with all the big guys at Understanding Ag and Regenerative Ag. You're adding that female touch into Understanding Ag, which I think is really important. And we need more female people in this space. And we also need more female nutritionists that can kind of talk more about these nutritional differences in food, both plant and animals, that's grown in healthier soil. So thank you for your work. And I'm excited at the end, we'll touch base as to like how people can get in touch with you and potentially work with you. So as I mentioned offline, I kind of want to dive in today into the concerns from a nutritionist's point of view about these plant-based alternatives. So I'm sure that my audience is very well aware that the big push right now is for these plant-based burgers like Impossible Meats, Beyond or Impossible Foods, and Beyond Meat burgers. And so I'd love to dive in with you some of the nutritional concerns, and then at the end we'll touch on obviously the environmental and soil health concerns. And it's funny, I listened to a talk that you gave about these plant-based burgers, and most of the people who are interested in these plant-based meats are interested in them because of health. So they think if I consume these, I will be healthier. And it's just funny because they can actually lead to a lot of health issues once a lot of this misinformation is like broken into and we dive into it. So from your point of view, what are some of the bigger topic issues with these plant-based burgers? And then we can dive into some of the details.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I first started learning about them, when I first started hearing about them originally, all the buzz about it, I just thought it was going to be some silly fad, that was just going to like die out. I'm like, oh my God, people are going to figure out this stuff is really just processed junk. And, and it's just going to disappear. But then I started learning about how Bill Gates was funding it. And I thought, all right, this is a bigger issue than I originally thought. And so Understanding Ag wanted me to write a blog series, and then I decided to do a webinar about it. And at first I wasn't, I thought, oh, do I really want to go there? Do I want to talk about this? But yeah, it's extremely important. I'm glad I did a lot of research into it. But, the bigger issues for me, it's just another processed food, right? At the end of the day, it's deeply concerning to me that there's just this emphasis on technology to save us and to save our health and our planet. And so it just goes to show how far removed some of these people are from nature and what it means to eat whole food. And they know nothing about health and nutrition, right? So, um, yeah, I mean, the two primary ingredients that really bother me the most are the soy and the soy like hemoglobin, which we'll get into the details of that. But it's, the pea protein has its concerns too, which is primarily in the Beyond Meat products and
Yeah,
possibly.
actually, here, let me pull up the,
Yeah,
uh-oh.
you got
Yeah, let me
something
pull up some of the ingredients here. So I just made like a quick Word document. So we've got the
very detailed.
Impossible Burger.
Yep.
And so people can see, like, that's just a long list of things. So the soy protein concentrate, coconut oil, sunflower oil, and then all of these smaller ingredients. And then for the Beyond Burger, we've got pea protein isolate, expeller, pressed canola oil, refined coconut oil, maltodextrin, all these crazy things. So just wanted to give some context for what are in these burgers.
That's really helpful. Yeah, people
Yeah.
can, just go right online and pull that up and, look at it when you're in the store.
Yeah.
Just quick aside, me and my boyfriend were in the store last night, health food store, and we were looking at the Impossible Meat and the Impossible Foods burgers and the Beyond Meat burgers, and we were like, one of these days, we gotta just try it. I'm just so curious what it tastes like. I haven't tried it yet, and I'm
I
curious.
haven't either.
I just like as much as I've learned about it at this point, I don't even want a bite of this stuff, but I'm curious. I'm really curious what it tastes like. But we were like, not today, I can't do it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just it's good you pulled that up because in my webinar, maybe we can throw that in the show notes if people want
Yeah,
to watch
for
that.
sure.
I presented those studies, right? The consumer research studies on number one, what drives consumers to want these products, right? And it is primarily for health reasons. And Impossible Foods, along with these other companies, they've made it really clear that they're number one, they're trying to target all consumers, not just vegans and vegetarians. So they're really trying to convert people from meat eaters to plant-based meats. And number two, well, particularly Impossible Foods, is their main mission is they want to rid the world of all animal agriculture by 2035. They've made that very clear. It's their mission statements on their website. So very aggressive, I feel like, attack on farmers and ranchers right now. So so consumers are going in the direction of health. They're consuming these products. They think it's going to make them healthier. And when there's been surveys on, hey, why don't you just look at these two products, right, and analyze the nutrition facts first. We're not going to tell you which one's plant-based meat, which one's the burger, or the real beef burger. And if you look at the nutrition facts, yeah, they're pretty comparable, interestingly. And that's by design, of course. Impossible Foods wanted to be very nutritionally similar, just based on nutrition facts.
Right.
And so when people were asked to compare the nutrition facts, they about 45% of people chose the plant-based product. So it was almost a 50-50 split, right? So you have half that thought this was better, and it's hard to tell just based on the nutrition facts, though, because they're very similar. However, when they threw in the ingredients for each product, right, and then said, okay, which one's better, product A, product B, clearly, if you see the long list of ingredients, people would be able to figure out that's the plant-based meat. And I think it was maybe 40% of people still chose product A, which is the plant-based meat. So again, you have it's pretty split. So the same study, they went one step further and asked these participants, well, why did you choose it based on seeing the nutrition facts and the ingredients? And what most respondents actually ended up saying, or a good majority of them said, was they felt the nutrition facts were more influential than the ingredients, which told me that, right, it was so weird. So that tells me that most Americans don't know how to read food labels, right? We don't know how to really prioritize certain things on the food label, because if you're just looking at the calories and the proteins and the fats and the carbs, that's all wrong. I tell all my patients, number one, your eyes need to go right to those ingredients. What is that food made of? I don't care how many carbs and fats and protein is in it if it's made out of junk.
Yeah.
So we need to look at the ingredients first, and that needs to be priority number one. But so that's what's wrong.
Yeah.
stuff.
It seems like so many Americans are just focused on like macronutrients, which again, macronutrients do matter. Calories matter, macronutrients matter, but these micronutrients, these like as Fred Provenza, these secondary nutrients, polyphenols, and all of these things are important too. And I think one issue that the bigger issues that you brought up in your previous talks with these ingredients are the allergenicity and the contaminants.
Yes.
And we're not saying that, like, for example, soy food itself, like soybean itself is a big issue. It's just like how we've grown them, what chemicals we've used to grow them. They're genetically modified, they're altered, they're not in their traditional form. That we've created them into these frankenfoods. And you just do a great job talking about the issues that we have seen in studies with these modified protein sources. So I think if we could start with the issues that you see with the protein sources, and then we can move to the fat sources. So it
Yeah.
seems like what are the main protein sources that these plant-based burgers use?
Well, thank you for the compliment. Yeah, I mean, in that presentation, in the articles I wrote, I really tried to back these, claims up with a lot of research and what I know within, my profession. So the processed proteins, the soy and the pea, for one, they're often hexane produced. So the hexane is a chemical solvent. It's a no neurotoxin, so it's something we really don't want in food. Um, and the amount of hexane that we see in the average soy protein is like 5 times the, actually, I think it's more than that. I'd have to go back and listen to what I said in there. I think it's 5 times the amount of the legal limits that they allow in Europe. So, they have very different standards in Europe, right, for their food in regards to chemicals and GMOs. But yeah, it's just all the hexane chemical processing is a big concern. And then when we high heat process these things, the soy and the pea protein, it leads to all these unknown compounds that we probably haven't even discovered yet. We do know one for sure. There's a little bit of research on it called lysinoalanine. And this is not a natural amino acid that occurs in any food. It's just kind of like a result, a byproduct of the processing. We don't know what this thing does in human body, right? We don't have any research on this. And so we have this unnatural compound that's formed. We're also stripping these proteins away from their whole food form. So like one of the questions I get from people all the time, is what's the best protein powder? What's your favorite protein powder? And I'm like, none of it. It's all processed. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've used a little collagen powder and stuff like that. It can be really helpful for, the joints. It's helped me actually a lot for my joints. But I try not to be too like married to any one thing. It's like try to get it from your food. I want you to get protein from your food, whole food as much as possible. But it's especially concerning to process plant proteins because of, again, the chemical manipulation and these unnatural compounds that are forming, and then the phytates, right, the lectins, these anti-nutrient compounds. And I pointed out Kayla Daniels' wonderful book called The Whole Soy Story. And it's an older book, but she did a fabulous job really just breaking down a lot of these anti-nutrient compounds. And I learned so much from her when I read that book years and years ago about all these plant compounds that are naturally occurring in food that plants kind of use as a defense system. Okay. It's part of how they defend themselves from excessive amounts of predation. And
They don't want to be eaten.
they don't want to be eaten, right? Plants don't want to be eaten. If anyone has ever, heard of Dr. Stephen Gundry and his book, The Plant Paradox, he kind of blew up the whole issue with lectins, right? Everyone knows about lectins because of him, which I was, thankful that he kind of brought that to everyone's awareness because, yeah, lectins can be a big problem for a lot of people. They cause digestive issues. They can lead to leaky gut. I would say that easily half of my patients or more have one or more autoimmune conditions. Half or more. And that's just in my patient population. And I think I heard you actually say something before when your talks that 1 in every 5 Americans is going to develop. And I guarantee it's going to be higher than that. Guarantee you it. I mean, because it's just what we're seeing out there. Eczema, psoriasis, even more severe issues like MS.
I think we've had to come up with new names recently.
Yeah, there's exactly, there's going to be all kinds of new weird autoimmune conditions that are developing, because essentially it's what it all boils down to is an immune system that's really out of whack. It's an immune system that's completely dysregulated and unbalanced. And there are sometimes plant compounds that really stimulate that whole thing. And I don't want to just pick on plant proteins. It's not just, plant foods that cause that, right? There's toxins that instigate that issue as well, and drive autoimmune processes and other foods. But these anti-nutrients are an issue.
Yeah. And I think some people who are very plant-based would combat you and say like, well, a lot of these anti-nutrients, you can remove them with proper cooking. And that's absolutely true. Like you brought up the example of soy has been a part of the Japanese tradition for thousands of years because they've properly fermented the soy. And so that can reduce some of these anti-nutrients. But these plant-based burgers are not doing these proper cooking methods. They are creating these new industrial fossil fuel intensive processes that, like you brought up, are creating these byproducts that we don't know the consequences of. And so they're not being prepared in the proper way to reduce these anti-nutrients. Like both you would, I consume plants, you consume plants. I try to cook them properly such that we reduce those amount of toxins. It's just, I don't think people realize that when you are industrially creating this faux burger, that those things don't go away. They can be intensified, or we get these unknown side effects.
Bingo. Excellent. Yeah. I mean, for one, if people are making these foods like a staple food in their diet, I mean, Asian cultures, soy was never really this major staple food. That's a myth. They would eat it as maybe a condiment or something to accompany a meal. So I made a point of saying in my talk and in my articles that, eating, a little organic miso soup, or, having some tamari or whatever with your sushi.
Soy sauce.
Yeah, exactly. A little splash of soy sauce. Or if you're having some peas with your meal, I'm not anti-soy and anti-peas by any means, but yes, it's this processing of it and eating high amounts of it, as a staple food that I have major issues with. And yes, there's the when we can pressure cook certain foods like beans and legumes, you can actually destroy the lectins. So I love the Instant Pot. I'm a big fan of pressure cooking because it can destroy some of those plant compounds. Fermentation can do that too. For example, until I found out with through food sensitivity testing that I'm sensitive to soy, I used to eat tempeh because I loved the taste of tempeh, but it turns out it sets off my immune system, and my, some issues like psoriasis and things cleared up when I got off of it. But, tempeh, when you ferment soy, it helps to reduce some of the phytoestrogens and the goitrogen compounds that can impact thyroid function. But, this is not a fermented food, right? Yeah, we know the plant-based meats are just processed versions of these foods. One thing I think is while we're still on the topic of the anti-nutrients is the aquaporins. I think you heard me talk about that in the webinar. And that was something very new to me. I can guarantee you most of your audience probably has never heard of aquaporins, right? And even Dr. Gundry did a webinar about it, I think several months ago, saying it was new to him. And he's like the anti-nutrient expert, or one of them. So aquaporins are in soy, they're in spinach, they're in so many different plant foods that if your immune system reacts to aquaporins, that's really alarming, because we know that there's certain proteins. I think it's called AQP4 protein. I always say it wrong, but there's a protein within the blood-brain barrier that when the aquaporins they share cross reactivity with that protein in the brain. So in other words, if your immune system is attacking the aquaporins in the food, it starts attacking that protein in the brain, the blood-brain barrier, that looks very similar to the aquaporins. Mm-hmm. That's scary. We're talking about leaky brain there. If anyone's heard of, leaky gut, there's a syndrome called leaky brain as well.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
Yeah.
The aquaporins, those are present in the plants regardless, or are they like intensified in the cooking process or anything?
They are definitely in the plants regardless. It's a part of the like water channel membranes, within those foods. I can't remember the whole list of them, but I think they're also in tomatoes. I think they're in tomatoes. Spinach is the one I commonly see a lot of reactions to, spinach and soy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and guess what? You cannot pressure cook them away. You can't ferment them away. You absolutely cannot destroy aquaporins. And not everybody's reactive to the aquaporins. That's why the testing is really important, because if I see someone has elevated antibodies in response to aquaporins,
Yeah.
I know that they're probably setting themselves up for potential autoimmune issues of the brain, or
Yeah.
even just neurological issues, Parkinson's, dementia, Alzheimer's, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And again, like, it's not like we're trying to create fear mongering around food. It's a
Yeah.
completely different story if you have seasonally eating things occasionally versus consuming these things every day. Like, for example, you take a soy protein workout shake after your workout every day, you pound that down, or you have these plant-based burgers every single day, or if they all fast food chains switch to these and people are getting these plant-based burgers every single day. It's a different story with, I guess, like the amount that you're giving your body. But that, I did not know about that. I want to dive in. I want to look into that afterwards, the aquaporins.
Yeah, there's I can send you some interesting articles and the
Yeah.
research on it, but yeah, it's fascinating.
And then you talk about how a lot of these proteins are regulated. So for example, fish protein, that's regulated. Is the pea protein not really, like, the standard's not really regulated?
I don't believe that one is. And I'd have to look into that again. Yeah, it's interesting that like soy proteins aren't, but then fish, I mean, animal products just get treated differently from certain plant foods. So
Right.
yeah, I would imagine that there's probably, if there's no regulations on the soy, they're probably not looking at the hexane and pea proteins either.
Yeah. Curious, what are the ingredients that they use for these plant-based burgers to give it this like meaty taste? Again, I haven't tried it. I don't really, I don't really want to, but apparently people say that they get this like meaty vibe. What are the ingredients that they use to make that? And are there issues with that?
Yeah, well, okay, so that's a very important topic, because that's one of the other big things that I mentioned before, the soy lake hemoglobin.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to know, I was going to bring this up before, that a lot, it's not just, about picking on Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. I mean, they're the big guys. They're the well-known ones out there of the, of all the brands, but there are a lot of the big meat companies that are involved now in their own this whole movement of plant-based meats. They have their own plant-based meat lines,
Oh,
JBS, Tyson's, Smithfield's. I don't know if you knew that. But yeah, they're all involved. They have their own plant-based meat lines, but there's only one company that has soy like hemoglobin. That is Impossible Foods. Okay. And essentially, this is a very controversial ingredient, and I'm been doing a lot of research on it more lately, because my next article is going to be about this. And so soy like hemoglobin is the compound that gives them their meaty taste, and it makes it look like it's bleeding. It's basically like plant blood. I know, super creepy. But what it is, so very early on, I guess, Impossible Foods, they have this whole story on their website that very early on in their research, they discovered the soy like hemoglobin. So it's actually like hemoglobin that accumulates around like the nodules within the root system of the soy plants. And they found, they found a way to kind of isolate it and use that as an ingredient, but they realized it was not going to be sustainable. And I think it's a joke of what they said on their website, because they basically said, oh, we found that, digging up all these soy plants was really bad for the soil and releasing carbon, and, releases carbon. And I'm thinking, well, someone better give them, a clue that, hello, your industrial, farming practices of producing all this soy for your products is not helping either. But that's a whole other topic with the ecological concerns. So anyhow, they realized it wasn't sustainable. So they had to find a way to manufacture the soy like hemoglobin. So what they did was they took the genes from soy like hemoglobin and they inserted it into a yeast. Okay. And the yeast, they can then ferment it. It's a genetically engineered yeast. Okay. So then they ferment it and it produces GE soy like hemoglobin. So what we have now is an ingredient that, number one, has not been consumed by humans traditionally. Soy, we've never dug up roots and just eaten tons of soy like hemoglobin, right? And we've certainly never eaten the genetically modified version of it. And this, I could talk about kind of like the little history of what's happened here with the FDA and how they've approved this, because this is,
yeah.
I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
So when, yeah, so
What
when,
about this?
yeah, then Impossible Foods, when they put this on the market, when they try to get it onto the market rather, so most companies, they can, when there's a new ingredient on the market, they can kind of just give themselves the GRAS certification, which is generally recognized as safe. And they could just say that, like, oh, well, we have some evidence that this is an ingredient that we think is okay for humans, and we're just gonna put it on the market. And if the FDA challenges us, then we have to provide some evidence it's safe. But if not, we're cool, we're okay. We can kind of like fly under the radar. So Impossible Foods, to their credit, didn't do that. They actually did submit, to the FDA, like, hey, this is a new ingredient, but we think it's safe.
Yeah.
FDA said, no way. They actually rejected the claim, and they said, we think that you need to provide some evidence that this is a safe ingredient. So Impossible Foods did. But what they did, so this is 2015 was an FDA rejected it. 2018, 3 years later, Impossible Foods did some studies. I'm going to call SLH, so I'm say soy like hemoglobin every time. SLH, they did 3 different studies. They looked at, the byproducts of the fermentation process, because there were some, traces of the yeast in there. They claimed that was safe. And then they did a rat study, okay, on SLH. And what they did, it was a 28-day study, and they did 10 male rats and 10 female rats. Now, 2 big concerns with that is that, number one, when you're looking for what's called subchronic toxicity, signs of adverse reactions to some of these ingredients in rats, you usually need, number one, at least a minimum of 90 days, okay, for a study like that, which is equivalent to approximately 2 to 3 years of human life. So 90 days minimum, preferably a full 2-3 years, because that's a full life cycle of a rat, lifespan of a rat. So it was statistically weak in that respect, that it was only 28 days. And then they didn't even use a relatively significant number of rats in the study. Minimum should have been about 40, and they used half that, 20 rats total. And there were some adverse effects. Okay, now when I first read the research, I have the studies, I downloaded them all, I read them. I mean, I'm pretty smart when it comes to reading research, but I could not interpret this. I mean, you have to be sometimes a PhD, researcher in this field to really fully interpret the data, because just reading it, I couldn't really pick up on, were there statistically significant differences?
Yeah.
In some of the adverse effects that they did see in the rats that were fed the SLH. So I looked around online, and I did find a very interesting article. And again, maybe we can throw this in the show notes too.
Yeah.
From an organization called GMO Science, I believe they're called. And they had a PhD molecular geneticist, Michael Antonio. He was an Italian researcher. God bless him for digging into this study, because he found statistically significant adverse reactions in the rats fed to SLH. He found there were issues with weight changes, very significant issues with their blood chemistry changes, things that were that looked like signs of anemia, or even worse, like there could have been some issues later down the road with things like cancer, but they were showing some signs of maybe organ failure. Anemia, like I said, they were definitely picking up on some adverse changes in these rats given the SLH, and that was just 28 days.
Yeah.
Of course, Impossible Foods just kind of cut it off at 28 days, probably to save money, because these things cost money. And that's the other, the third major thing too. So number one, not a long-term study. Number two, didn't use enough rats. Number three, conflicts of interest. It was an in-house study.
Well, I'm gonna add a fourth. How is it okay that it's not tested in humans?
Right? There you go. Yeah.
Wow.
So, and I guess there's
a rabbit hole.
Yeah, and there's probably whatever ethical concerns with testing a new thing on humans, but I guess there are no ethical concerns with that, because people are the guinea pigs right now. It's available in retail stores, and we still don't know what this really does to humans. However, Center for Food Safety, fabulous organization, right? They're headed by a lawyer that's really pursuing this, and so he filed a lawsuit just within the last month, I believe, against the FDA for allowing this to be on the market without adequate safety studies.
Yeah.
So we need third-party research, long-term safety study, and we do need to see how, if human study subjects can be used in a trial, but we at least need to see what it does in rats first, right?
Right. Wow.
It's totally crazy. So
wait, so this is just in the Impossible burgers, right?
Yep, this is the only plant-based meat that has that ingredient. It's kind of like their little magic ingredient that they're very proud of.
So then what does like Beyond, like what are these other like Tyson's and all these other Beyond Meats, like what do they try to add the meatiness
So
flavor?
it's a lot of flavoring, and if you
Oh,
can go
okay.
back to actually the ingredients to the
Yeah, yeah, I'll go back right now.
Beyond Meat. So they use, well, to give it coloring, to make it look like blood, they use beets, and they
Beet
use
extract.
yep, beet juice extract. And then there's also there's natural flavors, which we don't know what that means. There's no regulation on natural flavors, by the way. So um, that can come from a natural food, but then it can be chemically manipulated in a lab. And so it's therefore not even in a natural form, but it was
Yeah.
something that was derived originally from something natural. And then you see there's yeast extract. Okay, yeast extract can sometimes be a source of MSG, and so that gives it that sort of that flavor, that kind of like what's called like umami flavor, if you've heard of that
Yeah.
before. That sort of meat like flavor that you also pick up on from mushrooms. So yeast and mushrooms, they're all
Okay.
fungal related. So yeah, it's all these weird little funky things that you don't know what's really giving the flavor. I don't know what
Right.
their secret sauce is, but we got a lot of additives in there. So
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. That uh, and it's crazy to me that a lot of them advertise that like, we are like our protein sources are obviously these like plants, but we're using non-GMO. And so I think a lot of people think that non-GMO is like this great option, which is a lot better than the GMO. Granted, there still are a lot of plants that or Impossible Burger is still using GMO, right?
absolutely, and they're like proud of it actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then some of these others are saying like they have I think the Beyond Meat has on there. Maybe I didn't, let me
I
see.
think some of that, yeah, I've questioned yeah, they say non-GMO project verified, but I've questioned, because I'm glad you brought that up, because yeah, non-GMO doesn't mean glyphosate free. And unfortunately, consumers think that it's free of toxins. That means organic, right? No, no, no. It can still have some of those contaminants, those pesticide residues.
Yeah.
Um, so there was, and I presented this in the webinar, there was an organization, I think Moms of America, they did actually submit samples of Beyond Meats Burger and Impossible Foods Burger to HRI Labs, awesome lab that does glyphosate testing.
I just did testing from that. I tested
Oh,
myself and I tested our water at
uh-huh.
farm property. I have very low levels and our water is like zero
Yeah,
detected. So I was proud of that. But so I've heard
good.
HRI is very much like the one to test this for.
They're awesome. My friend Larry Bolin has been very helpful. He works there, and he's been very helpful in getting me tuned into all the different research they're doing. So yeah, I've seen them test a lot of different things, and this one was really interesting to look at with the plant-based meats. And Beyond Meat actually did test relatively low for glyphosate. I think they still did have trace amounts, but Impossible Foods was a little elevated, and so they got a lot of backlash for that. But they just dismiss it as it's certain, below certain parts per billion or whatever, and it's not a concern. Is kind of how they dismiss it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
yeah,
if anyone is interested in like the glyphosate issues, we definitely check out what's Dr. Stephanie's, how do you say her last name? Seneff.
yeah,
Dr. Stephanie Seneff talks a lot about the potential issues that glyphosate has in the human body. I know one is it's a chelator, so it binds to these like heavy metals and like other minerals and nutrients in the soil. So it strips the soil of some nutrients.
mhm.
And then obviously it can cause a whole host of issues inside the body. And people just, it's not on the ingredient list, right? And so you don't think that it's there, but people forget that our industrial agriculture food system relies on glyphosate so much, and it's going to show up in a lot of these like processed, packaged foods, which is just yeah,
Yeah,
unfortunate.
and we know glyphosate now has been connected to cancer, and it's been Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, has had to pay out, billions in damages for farmers that were, developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma as a result of glyphosate exposure. So, yeah, it's scary stuff. It affects the microbiome big time. There's just a quick little aside there. Glyphosate impacts what's called the shikimate pathway. And that's something that it's a metabolic pathway in plants and different organisms, bacterial organisms, but humans don't have a shikimate pathway. And so Monsanto used to kind of say, oh, well, it's not going to affect human health because we don't have a shikimate pathway. It's only going to target weeds and pests and that sort of deal.
Oops.
We forgot we have a microbiome, I guess, with lots of critters in there, lots of bacteria that it can actually have an impact on. So,
Yeah. Oh man. It's just I feel like we could talk about the issues of plant-based burgers just like on and on. I do want to touch on the fat sources. So
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the people who are choosing these plant-based burgers, they've seen all the big headlines of like, reduce your red meat consumption, reduce your saturated fat consumption, because that's going to lead to heart issues. And so as a nutritionist, how do you explain to your patients and others that saturated fat has been wrongly demonized, and that's not the issue that we should be facing? That's been pushed as a distraction from all this other stuff going on. So I personally feel like that's one of the main reasons why people choose these Beyond Meat burgers, is because they're avoiding the saturated fat on meat. And then I'll pull up the fat sources real quick. So we've got the Impossible. It has coconut oil, sunflower oil, which is kind of funny to me because coconut oil is a highly saturated fat.
Yep.
Sunflower oil is high in PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and then the soy itself, I believe, will have some polyunsaturated fats, specifically like linoleic acid. And so we've got those in the Impossible, and then the Beyond Meat. It has the expeller pressed, canola oil. Canola oil is incredibly high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, and I don't even know. You can talk more about how it's actually made, and then you've got refined coconut oil. So, can you share a little bit about your beliefs on like the saturated fats, and then talk about the fats in these burgers too?
Yeah. Oh, bless your heart for bringing this up. So important. Saturated fats. I'll be tackling a lot of that too in some upcoming talks of mine. I'll be doing a webinar with Understanding Ag next month going into that, because and presenting case studies like, before and after results with people's cholesterol improvements and inflammation markers improving on a higher saturated fat diet, right? And lots of meat in their diet. So contradicts a lot of the bogus research that's out there about how bad meat is, and saturated fats are just, it's just that argument that needs to just go away. It's just not, there's no truth to the fact that saturated fats can drive cholesterol and heart disease and in the wrong direction. So it's all these bad plant oils that we've come to discover, and it's Nina Teicholz that's written The Big Fat Surprise. And it's an incredible book. She's done a lot of research, and I've linked her talks too in some of my articles, where she's really just dismantled all the research, a lot of the epidemiological research on these weak correlations between saturated fats and obesity and heart disease, et cetera. So what she really makes very clear, and what we've I've known for a while now, is that these plant-based fats, the soybean oil, the canola oil, that hide in so many foods and condiments, dressings, salad dressings, mayonnaise, even in so many packaged foods. And now here you have them in the plant-based meats. They're highly inflammatory. They're full of omega-6 fats. And then when you see this expeller pressed canola oil, it's just like, oh my God. It's just they're trying to make it sound like it's something nicer because it's not, chemical processed, but expeller is still a very, technically, from what I understand, they don't apply high heat in expeller pressing, but it is very high pressure. And so that does still create heat there. It still does heat it up to a certain point. So expeller press really isn't much difference, much different from non-expeller pressed oils, because it's still transforming that fat and converting it into what's, like more hydrogenated fats. So for the longest time, canola oil got touted as a healthy fat because I got a visitor. It's a healthy fat because it has high omega-3s. But when you heat those omega-3s, it transforms it in a way that they become hydrogenated, which is like turning it rancid, right? So you're just eating rancid fats. So, they're all the sunflower oil, unfortunately, same thing. You got high omega-6s in that. Coconut oil, I've kind of gone back and forth on coconut oil. I mean, I don't use much of it anymore. I try to be, local as possible with my food. So obviously coconuts aren't a local food. But I make exceptions. There's coffee and there's chocolate and all that stuff that doesn't come from here. But if I can cook with all these other wonderful fats like lard, bacon fat and tallow and ghee, I'd rather use those fats than use coconut oil. But coconut oil became like, the big darling of the functional healthcare community. A lot of nutritionists really touted it as a healthy fat, but coconut oil is actually really high in something called lauricidin. And if you have a lot of coconut oil, there's now some concerns that maybe that can negatively impact your microbiome because lauricidin has these antimicrobial properties to it. And also, the processing of coconut oil. Coconut oil, in order to take out the coconut flavor, they have to deodorize it. And so again, that's exposure to some chemicals. There's a deodorization process that takes place. So, I'd imagine that Impossible Foods probably does that to the coconut oil to take away that coconut flavor. But what they tried to do by adding in that coconut oil was to actually give it a similar fat composition to the meats. So they wanted to add in some saturated fats actually to make it look like, beef.
I see.
They're trying to mimic beef as much as possible. So.
I see. Okay, so they're using that because coconut oil is very high saturated fat. And so my philosophy with my food choices, I prioritize fats that are high in saturated fat because polyunsaturated fats, PUFAs, they oxidize
Yep.
at these higher temperatures. And people forget humans, we are 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And these vegetable oils, they reach very high temperatures when they're pushed and expelled and pressed out of these seeds. And so they're already oxidized because they have these polyunsaturated fatty acid chains, have kinks in them. And so they're very unstable. And so they can oxidize very easily. And so they're already oxidized and then they're going into a warm body.
Yeah.
And it's just like a recipe for oxidation. And I think that I'm not sure why that's not brought up enough in like mainstream health. Like I really don't understand because it's kind of obvious. And then I still do consume coconut oil on occasion because of the antimicrobial properties.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't like to I don't know. I don't like to have too much of it. I prefer tallow and steak fat. But it's yeah, exactly. It's just crazy. I didn't make that connection before about the coconut oil and the meat connection and how they tried to replicate that fat. I would say I think that they're probably taking coconut oil from coconuts in like the worst possible way possible. I think like unrefined, like virgin coconut oil. I actually found this brand that's certified regenerative organic.
Is it Dr. Bronner's?
Yeah, so I use that on occasion, but
yeah.
So I imagine they're not using best practices to get that oil out, and then they're already using these oxidized oils that are, for some reason, omega-6s are still praised, and this linoleic acid is still praised by some of these other health communities, but the health consequences, the oxidation, the increased inflammation, it's almost obvious.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point you bring up. Yeah, I mean, it just, first off, we have to think about the fact, if you go back to nature, like, where would our Paleolithic ancestors have derived these oils? They didn't have all these industrial processes, right, to extract these oils from seeds. So it's like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Things like coconut oil and olive oil and even avocado oil, if you're pressing oil from like the flesh of the plant and not the seed, then those oils are a little easier to extract through industrial mechanical processes. So that makes sense that we would have had probably some of those type of oils from plants in some traditional diets, depending on where people evolved in the world. So yeah, it's I will tell you, one of the most important tests that I use in my practice, I'm a big fan of a lot of testing, stool testing and organic acids and, looking at the microbiome, right? All those type of tests. And looking at hormones and food sensitivity testing and micronutrient testing. But one of the cheapest and like just most valuable tests is an omega test. And it's like $90. You can order it right online. You can do the test at home, and it'll give you your full profile of fats that they find within the red blood cells. Okay, because the membrane of your red blood cell has should have a very certain type of, it should be composed of certain type of fats. Should be close to 8 to 12% omega-3s. And then you should have a certain amount of omega-6s, because we need omega-6s, right? They're not, it's not an either or, it's a balance of both. And unfortunately, omega-6s do kind of get, villainized a little too much, but there's certain omega-6s that are healthy, and you do want them in a balance with the omega-3s. And the problem is most people have way too many omega-6s and not enough omega-3s, right? But that test is so cool. Omega Quant is the name of the test that I used. And they give you a really comprehensive breakdown of even different saturated fats and monounsaturated fats. So that's a test, highly recommend you check out sometime. And you can see what types of omega-3s you have within your cell membrane. So anyway, I mean, I would love to see an omega-3 test from someone that's just like eating a bunch of plant-based meat, right? They're probably awful.
I think people forget that like the fat that we consume is the fat that our body uses to create like all of our tissues. And I would imagine that if we had like that omega test done for the last like 30 years, with the increase in vegetable oil consumption, we'd see a huge increase in linoleic acid and omega-6 in our tissues when it should be a much smaller percentage.
Absolutely. It just goes back to eating food in the context of its whole food form, Yeah, there's all these beautiful phytochemicals and nutrients in that food that protect those fats. And that's even like, if you buy a fish oil, you're going to see vitamin E or rosemary extract in there most of the time. And that's
I didn't know that.
yep, it preserves the fats.
Mm.
So yeah, they usually put high doses of vitamin E. Now, one interesting thing here is if people take like too much fish oil, it can actually drive down your your vitamin E levels. So if you take a lot of omega-3s, it can drive down your vitamin E level. And why would that be? Because your body is then having to use up a lot of vitamin E to protect from oxidation of those oils.
Ah,
I wonder if even like excessive consumption of omega-6s probably has the same effect, like you're using up a lot of your vitamin E.
yeah.
So,
Wow. Wow.
yeah.
Okay, so I know we're reaching close to the end here.
Yeah.
But I did want to point out one more thing that maybe someone can fact check me. I did this really quickly before our call. But I did a little price comparison
Mm.
of price per pound. The Impossible Burger is $16.66. Beyond Meat is $10.58, and then this is USDA like average ground beef price, or I kind of took it from like Apsey Farms, White Oak Pastures, like a lot of online retail stores. Price per pound of ground beef from regenerative farms is $8 to $9. And I guess it was hard. I did this math really quickly. They don't advertise this. They advertise it as these like value packs and like
Yeah.
larger patties to like almost make you think that, oh my God, $5.29, like maybe that's $5 a pound. It seems like there's some creative marketing there with the prices too.
Nope, you're spot on. That was excellent, actually. And I haven't done that price comparison either, but I've seen that same thing in the store when it looks like it's you're comparing apples to apples, and they're not comparing the, per pound. It's not a package of, it's not a pound of meat that you're getting compared to the pound of beef.
Yeah.
So make several patties out of that pound, right? And
yeah,
it's like, yeah, it's actually way more expensive. So yeah, the plant-based meats are way more expensive.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Sara, so how can people find you? And how can people who are potentially interested in working with you, how can they get that started?
Yeah, well, so if you want to read some of my articles and just connect with me through Understanding Ag, well, you can learn more at understandingag.com. And so that's the organization, of course, that's partnered with Alan Williams, Gabe Brown, Ray Archuleta, Shane New, really great group of guys. So that's where you're going to learn more about the regenerative agriculture work that we're doing. And if you want to learn more about me and my clinical practice and work with me or just connect with me, you can email me at Sara, no H, SARA, at eco-nutrition.com. And I have the URL for eco-nutrition.com, but I haven't built a website yet. So that's been on my to-do list for a couple of years now. So any website designers out there too that are interested in helping, reach out. But yeah, that's how people get in touch with me. Maybe we put some links too.
That's great. Oh yeah, I'll include all of that in the description, but we're going to have a lot more talks, recorded webinar or discussions in the future because we have a lot in common. And just for my audience to know, like you guys are looking at the next like female nutritionist of the regen ag space. So I'm really excited about all the work that Sarah's doing with all of the big leaders in the regenerative agriculture space now. And so make sure you guys check out Understanding Ag. Sarah's really, I think, helping progress that movement. She's adding that female connection. She's talking about the differences in the nutrition quality of food grown in a regenerative manner versus the conventional manner. And we didn't have enough time to talk about that today, but I would love to do just a separate talk about that because that's just a whole nother big important piece that I think a lot of mainstream medicine is missing, because a tomato grown today is not the same as a heirloom tomato grown in good soil. So yeah.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is awesome. I'd love to come back. So
Yeah,
anytime.
of course, always. All right. Thanks, Sarah.